Hi everyone, my name is Paolo Gasti. I am one of the co-founders at Keyless, a startup that works on biometric authentication with privacy-preserving technologies. I'm very happy to be here today at the conference, and I would like to thank Fido and the organizers of Authenticate 2022. What I'd like to do today is take a few minutes of your time to talk about the challenges with PSD2 and GDPR and how using the right authentication tool and the right authentication technology can be your competitive advantage. So let's get started. So today I'm going to introduce friction and cost relative to authentication. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but it's good to maybe a quick refresher. Then I'm gonna zoom in on PSD2 and what is relevant with respect to authentication and usability and multiple factors of authentication. And then I'll spend a few words on GDPR, data privacy, and how this affects the other aspects, such as, again, PSD2 and so on. I will give a brief overview of how at Keyless we solve these challenges, but I would like to keep this general, so what I'm going to discuss doesn't apply necessarily just to Keyless, but can also be used as a broader roadmap to address these problems in a way that is aligned with what the users want and is still secure and compliant. And then I will conclude with a short summary. Okay, so let's talk briefly about friction. So there is a large number of users that abandon their cards and their transaction at login, and there is a significant number of shoppers that have at least once quit their purchase because the process is very cumbersome, and this many Gen Zers and younger users have confirmed that they were willing to complete their purchase, but they were also unable to do that because they weren't unable to authenticate, because, for instance, they forgot their password. So authentication is a big factor in losing sales and losing transactions, and this is primarily because of the methods that are used today for authentications, right? While passwords might look like something that everybody understands and everybody can use, what's easier than that to deploy and what's easier than that to use, I don't have to convince probably anyone at this conference that the reality is very different. And it's not just about friction. It's not just about abandoning cards and transactions. It's also about the cost for this. Right? Password need to be reset, and that has a cost. There is productivity loss in all this process, and this also has, of course, a cost. And there are alternative methods that need to be used to reset or to further authenticate users that also have a cost themselves. And text messages is just one such example, and these costs are non-negligible. So if you look at the whole picture, what you have is something that creates friction, something that dissuades user from completing what they're there to complete, and it's also very expensive for everybody involved, right? In addition to losing sales, you also have to pay money for the system to work, which is far from ideal, right? So the first thing that you might think by looking at this thing is biometrics seems to be something that can address this problem. Right, they provide a good user experience, right? I don't have to type anything. I don't have to remember anything. I cannot forget anything, right? In addition to the good user experience, there is some very strong identity assurance. I'm not just authenticating you because you happen to remember some secret, but rather I'm authenticating you based on who you actually are, right? I can measure something about you that is unique about you, and that's how I can authenticate you. So again, good user experience, strong identity assurance. Anyone can use it, and everyone can use it anywhere, right? I can just glance at my device, touch a sensor, right? Perform a very simple action that anyone can do at any time and anywhere. And in addition to that, there's no notion of reuse, right? Reusing a password across multiple websites is, of course, something that significantly impacts security. But with biometrics, nothing like that happens. Every biometric sample is fresh and new, and therefore there is this uniqueness of every authentication attempt. And in addition to that, I can easily tell you my password, but I cannot tell you I cannot give you my biometrics, so that you can later on provide fresh samples of that. So no sharing, no reuse, and therefore increased security and lower chance of account takeover. And it has been shown in multiple studies that there is also a lower operational cost associated with biometrics. Setting up a system might be more complex with biometrics than with passwords, but at the same time, once the system is set up, the operational costs are lower because of all the factors that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. So let's jump to PSD2 and what that entails in terms of requirements for authentication and why it's relevant to this talk. So PSD2 is an authentication directive for financial transactions. So the idea is that with PSD2, in order to authenticate a user to perform, for instance, a wire transfer, a bank transfer, or a payment, there have to be at least two authentication factors, two distinct authentication factors. So the possible factors are something you know, so a password or a PIN, something you have, so a USB token, a phone, any piece of hardware that cannot be that you have and you can prove that you have. And then finally something that you are, or an inheritance factor, so typically your biometric traits. The idea is that in order to be PSD2 compliant, you need to choose at least two factors from two different modalities. So for instance, you can choose something you know and something you have, which could be plug in a USB device and enter your password, or something you know and something you are. So enter a password and provide your biometrics. So this is a requirement to be PSD2 compliant. Now, an important caveat here is that biometrics, as in local biometrics, things Face ID or Touch ID, those are not considered under PSD2 as something you are. These are considered something you have. So the idea here is that your biometric on an iPhone unlocks the local enclave to disclose some secret known to the device. But if you think about the broader system, if you're authenticating remotely with this token locked under your biometrics, the remote system doesn't know that there has been a biometric authentication, doesn't know which biometric sample was used, doesn't know whether you changed your biometric template yesterday or the week before, or someone else replaced it with theirs. There's no information about the authentication process itself that can lead to a meaningful statement about the security of this authentication event. We know that something happened that triggered the disclosure of this secret token, but we don't know what that is. It might have been biometrics, but it might have been a PIN, or it might have been something completely unrelated. It could have been part of an attack. So for all these reasons, local biometrics under PSD2 are not considered as an inheritance factor, right, as your biometric, but rather as typically a possession factor. Right? You have access to a phone that is unlocked with your biometrics, and that has some secret that can be used to prove possession of the phone. So this is a big issue because out of this factor, using, let's say, Face ID or Touch ID plus, let's say, a password covers, plus the possession of the phone covers only one of the two factors, right? Only covers the possession factor, and therefore is not sufficient per se. Let's switch to GDPR for a second. So the idea of GDPR, of course, is to protect users' privacy and to regulate how users' data is used. Biometric data is very sensitive and therefore has a special place under GDPR as a special category of information, and which requires additional protections. So this means that as as a company under GDPR, you have to protect. If you're storing any biometric, you have to put additional measures in place to make sure that you're securely handling, storing, and operating that system. In addition to that, of course, there's always the fear of leaking this information because of a compromise, and therefore vendors are typically reluctant to have server-side biometric, which, based on PSD2, it's the way to achieve a biometric factor out of the two needed. So here if you look at all these requirements, if we just summarize what I've discussed so far and put it all together, so if you want to be compliant with PSD2, for instance, and if you want to process payments, you need to have multiple factors. Now, biometrics on a device do not count as a biometric factor, so you would want to have some external biometric. Those are highly regulated under GDPR, and there's always the risk of leaking those. This is really a place that seems pretty complicated to put all these requirements together, right? So what you would really want to achieve is reduce friction and cost, and therefore have biometrics as your primary mode of authentication. You would ideally, reducing factor also means being able to use the same biometric on multiple devices, right? If I have a laptop and if I have a phone, why would I have to go over an enrollment process on each of them, right? When biometrics could be stored somewhere else and I could just use them to authenticate every time. Right? I want to use multiple devices. I want to be able to recover my account if I lose my phone. With local biometric, I lose the biometric, and that's far from ideal, because now I have to prove again that I'm the right person. I have to re-enroll and so on and so forth. And again, under GDPR, privacy of the biometric data is extremely important, both for the user but also for whoever operates them. So the approach that we took to protect this biometric data and still achieve all these requirements is what is called secure multi-party computation. So the idea of secure multi-party computation is that you can actually encrypt data and then perform some computation on the encrypted data itself. So you can manipulate, in a way, data without actually touching it. And for this, I often use this analogy of this seal box, where the operator can manipulate something within the box, but without ever touching it. With secure multi-party computation, you go one step further. You also put a piece of plastic in front of the glass. So not only you cannot actually touch the things that you're manipulating, you can also not see the things that you're manipulating and how the result of this manipulation look like, right? So this is for secure multi-party computation. I can summarize as operating on encrypted data without ever being able to decrypt it and without ever decrypting it, right? But what does it mean in the context of authentication, and in particular biometric authentication, right? So if you look the system as a whole, so you will have your phone that is interacting with some cloud resources, some resources in the cloud. In order to authenticate, you provide some fresh biometric sample. The phone, the device, will run a secure multi-party or an MPC, a secure multi-party computation protocol with the cloud, which will encrypt this biometric, send it to the cloud. The cloud will have a copy of some encrypted biometric there. We'll be able, through this MPC protocol, to compare the two without learning anything other than the result of this comparison. And if the comparison is successful, then yes, we can confidently say that this is the user, but we cannot say, as a cloud, we cannot say anything else. And if the comparison is unsuccessful, then we can deny this authentication attempt, because there's no reason to believe that this is the user. And yet, because all these comparisons were done on encrypted data, so on encrypted biometric data in this case, we cannot tell, as the cloud, we cannot tell any information about this particular user. And this goes all the way to say that not only we cannot tell if this user, for instance, if we were to use face, not only if this user is blonde, has blue or brown eyes, we cannot tell all this, but also because of multi-party computation, the cloud can also, if done properly, the cloud can also not test whether a particular image taken from Facebook or from somewhere else on the internet matches a particular user. And this is extremely important for GDPR, because the idea is that not only I cannot look at the data that I'm storing, but given a sample from a user, given a face taken from the internet, I can also not tell if it matches any account. And this is a requirement for GDPR in order for this data to be considered not biometric, so not requiring the same level of protection that biometric data would normally require. So just to summarize, what we're able to do, what you can do with this technology is to operate on biometric data only in encrypted form, which means that under all regulations, you never have access to this biometric data in the first place, and therefore you don't have to go through all the additional protections that are mandated by GDPR for biometric data. And you don't have to do it because this data is inherently protected by the protocol. So even if the cloud is compromised, there's no biometric data that can be leaked. And additionally, even if the phone or if the user's device is compromised, there's no biometric data there. As I said earlier, these templates are stored encrypted in the cloud, and therefore the phone doesn't have to store anything. Right? So this is a brief overview of how secure multi-party computation can be used in the context of biometric authentication to fulfill at least the privacy requirement, but as we'll see in a second, also the multi-factor requirement. Speaking of which, I just want to spend a few minutes or less on how Keyless uses this technology to achieve that goal. So here the idea is that we combine secure multi-party computation to authenticate the user with cryptographic tools to authenticate the user's device, and therefore by doing this we achieve two-factor, possession factor and inheritance factor. So we can authenticate with biometrics, inheritance factor, and we can authenticate the device, which represents a possession factor. And by virtue of that, we achieve under PSD2 two independent authentication factors without the user doing anything. The user will just look at the phone, will capture the face, and run this distributed secure multi-party computation protocol that will then lead to an authentication. Now, in addition to that, at Keyless, we also store a private key as part of this process, and this private key is only disclosed at the end of a successful authentication protocol and only to the user. So what it means is that the user can use this key to authenticate, to sign statements and transactions, to decrypt data. At this point, anything that you can do with a key, you can do with this system. So this goes beyond authentication per se, and authentication, of course, is a very good, very useful starting point for this technology. Right? So through this technology, again, we can authenticate users through two independent factors and not storing any biometric data effectively anywhere in a way that it can be accessed. Everything is always stored encrypted in a way that cannot be decrypted. And we can still operate on that data without having to decrypt. So just to summarize, these earlier seemingly conflicting requirements are no longer conflicting. Right? We have multiple authentication factor. We can have multiple authentication factor with this technology. We can have reduced friction and cost. Now we can authenticate from the point of view of the user as if we were using only biometrics, right? The possession factor is completely transparent, so we can just authenticate the user using biometrics, so at least that's the user experience. Because no biometric is stored on the user's phone, it doesn't matter which device we're using, as long as it's one of the devices that has been enrolled, we can always use the same biometric across multiple devices. In addition to that, what it means is that regardless of which device I'm using to authenticate, there is a strong guarantee that it's the same face, it's the same biometric, it's the same person from the point of view of a biometric, because the enrollment happened only once and the same biometric data is used regardless of the device. So Again, multiple devices with the same level of assurance, and the ability to recover an account. If I lose my phone, it doesn't really matter. No biometric was there in the first place, and therefore recovery is very simple. And of course, the most important thing here is no biometric data. Despite all this, no biometric data is observed by the cloud. No biometric data leaves the user device, if not in encrypted form. And therefore, we have strong benefits in terms of regulations under GDPR, but also in terms of security, because no biometric data can be stolen or exfiltrated. So if you look at it this way, this is a strong competitive advantage. Having this technology for you can be a strong competitive advantage because you can heavily simplify your authentication process, you can reduce friction, and you can provide strong and compliant security. All right. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this talk.